Hello and welcome to a very special Brexit Central and Labour Leave production, which is going to be talking about everything that's going on in the world of Brexit right now. It's Monday the 3rd of December. A lot might happen before you see this in the next few hours, but for now, let me introduce the panel we have today. We've got John Mills. John Mills is the founder of Labour Leave and a businessman and Eurosceptic of very long standing who was involved in the first referendum back in 1975. To his right is Brendan Chilton, who is a Labour councillor in Ashford, and he's the General Secretary of Labour Leave. On my right, Robert Courts, who's a Member of Parliament for Witney in Oxfordshire, which you may recall used to be David Cameron's constituency. He was indeed the MP who won the by-election after David Cameron left office. And he was until July a parliamentary private secretary at the Foreign Office, but resigned in opposition to the Chequers proposal. And on his right is Anne-Marie Trevelyan, who's been MP for Berwick-upon-Tweed since 2015, and until a few days ago she was a parliamentary private secretary at the Department for Education, having previously served at the Department for the Ministry of Defence. But again, she has resigned in order to oppose the deal that is currently on the table. Perhaps I can start by asking you all, perhaps with members of Parliament here, did you believe when this process started that we would be here at this juncture? I don't know. I mean, I was at Lancaster House. I saw the speech that Theresa May gave, which seemed at the time to be a unifying speech that everybody seemed to accept.
It was extraordinary, really, because the party elected a Remainer after David Cameron stood down, which didn't fill me with confidence. But then she really seemed to listen and take up the mantle of what that Brexit referendum result had said. She really did. And that Lancaster House speech absolutely seemed to understand those profound root frustrations that had brought so many people out of not voting at all and to cast a very clear vote, and understand that they believed that their vote had a voice. I think that was really important at the time. She really gave the impression that she understood that this wasn't like normal politics. And that seems to have just filtered away ever since then.
Do you feel the same, Robert?
Yeah, I mean, Lancaster House set out a very clear vision and a clear direction of travel, and it seemed to analyse the fundamental issues that lay behind people's reasons for wanting to leave the European Union, and leaving the single market and leaving the customs union are absolutely central to those. And we've certainly moved a very long way from those days where we now have proposals that give very severe cause for concern about democratic accountability and sovereign control of our country.
John, did you applaud the Lancaster House speech when it was made back in January 2017?
Yes, we did. I mean, we had some reservations from the Labour side, but on the whole, we thought that was the right way ahead. Coming out of the single market, coming out of the customs union would provide a clear way to something probably like the Canada plus deal, which has always seemed to me to be the best outcome. So that was something that at the time we supported, and I must say it's been very disappointing to see the way in which the whole situation has resolved away from that, largely I think because of the election in 2017, which removed any real prospect of the Canada type deal, because people were not prepared to vote for an outcome which kept them out of the single market.
You agree with that?
Yeah, and of course, there were just in the referendum around 4 million Labour voters who went for leave. And if you take our 2017 vote, that goes up to just under 5 million. And when the Prime Minister gave that speech, we were sitting there thinking, my God, there goes that vote. It was politically brilliant for her, but at the same time, what the country voted for. And now to be where we are, really, I mean, it's quite extraordinary to see this complete reversal. And then on our side as well, this idea that all these people voted leave still want to be in a customs union, that their trade policy is determined by Brussels. I think both sides here are a bit off the, in the wrong way.
But of course, at that election in 2017, the official Labour manifesto seemed to be completely accepting of Brexit and leaving the single market, leaving the customs union, all that goes with it.
Yeah.
Do you think that the Labour Party leadership has been, perhaps you wouldn't want to say dishonest, but confused about its position ever since?
I think confused is a good word. Certainly when we saw the manifesto, when it came out, we were delighted. It was a Brexit manifesto. And between the two parties, 80% of those who voted for Brexit parties. And unfortunately some strange things have happened since. but I just don't understand why on earth you'd want to stay in a customs union and at the same time have your own shadow trade secretary.
Yes, I think the Labour Party was a bit ambivalent, to be honest with you, in the 2017 election. In the Leave seats, it was very much promulgating the manifesto, which had a clear commitment to coming out of the European Union. But at the same time, in the sort of Leave-orientated seats, particularly in London and university cities, there was a great sort of element of support, possibly for a second referendum and so on. So, I mean, I think Labour's never really had a very clear view about what it wanted to achieve out of all this.
I think it's very important that we look at what a customs union is, just so that everybody understands that, because that does, it's central to the issue. It does sound very technical, but if you're in a customs union, you're not a member of it, you are surrendering control of your own external trade policy, and there is no reciprocity, so that if the EU signs a trade deal with another country, they will have access to the UK's market, but the UK won't have access to theirs. That is a real surrender of sovereignty, of control, as well as all the benefits of Brexit that we would hope to see, whatever position people took on it originally.
I was going to ask in respect to that election in 2017, Robert, you are a Leaver, but you represent a seat that I think marginally voted Remain.
54%, yeah.
Did you feel any negativity as a result of that, or had your constituency taken at face value the result?
Yeah.
And say, okay, let's get on with it?
Yeah, the vast majority of people in West Oxfordshire take the same view, I think, as is taken in the rest of the country, which is whatever position they took in 2016, they accept that this is a once-in-a-lifetime vote, the decision had been made, and now it's been made, we've got to get on with it. So they either take that view with enthusiasm because they voted for Leave, or they take the view by and large, although they voted to Remain, they now think that they're Democrats, they respect the result, and we go ahead.
And Anne-Marie, you represent a Leave constituency as well as being a Brexiteer,
The Leave constituency in the northeast of England, the only outspoken Sir Ronnie Campbell, who's one of my neighbours in Northumberland, Labour MP, was also a Leave supporter, but very, very quietly so, because the rest of the northeast is full of Remain MPs. I was very happy to champion it. It was quite an experience. Interestingly, UKIP pulled out their candidate in 2017 so that UKIP voters could support me as the clear Leave person who was going to come back from the northeast and make sure the northeast's very clear Brexit voice was heard in Westminster. And what was really interesting is that about 4,000 Labour voters also voted for me and said to me often, "We're just lending it to you this time round, Pet, don't think you're keeping it," which was fair enough. But for precisely that means they felt so let down by Labour MPs in the northeast in 2017, who, whilst in the manifesto very clearly, I mean, it was a cut and paste from ours, really. John McDonnell did that very clever, bringing it out a week early, thing. It was almost word for word what it said in our manifesto. So without doubt, Labour was supposed to be, preaching Brexit at that election too. But it was very noticeable in the northeast, a very core Leave area of the country, that it was very quiet from anyone but me, who was very happy to champion what the Prime Minister had put into the manifesto.
And of course, after that election, something very significant happened. Obviously, the Conservative government lost its majority, and Theresa May lost some very key people around her. Now, Nick Timothy, her former Chief of Staff, I think, was very much responsible for writing big chunks of the Lancaster House speech. He obviously departed after the election, taking responsibility for some decisions that led to what happened during that campaign, which is for another day. But do you think that his departure has affected the way that she has handled this situation? Because she doesn't appear to have anyone directly around her who truly believes in this adventure that we're embarked upon.
It certainly seems to have done. I mean, it's quite clear that if you look at what Nick Timothy's saying in the Daily Telegraph, amongst other places, that he's now very critical of a policy, and it's difficult to see that if he had still been there, that the policy would be what it is.
And on the Labour side, Jeremy Corbyn, of course, a lot of us who've studied politics for quite a long time will remember Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell going through voting lobbies against the Treaty of Maastricht, against the Treaty of Nice, against the Treaty of Lisbon. And of course, his position now seems to have shifted rather. Who is in control? And this is a genuine question. Who is in control of the Labour policy on all this? Is it Keir Starmer? Is it Corbyn? Is it people around Corbyn?
Well, I think the Labour Party is pulled in a lot of different directions. I mean, if you look at the MPs in Parliament, probably 90% of them or so are Remainers. And that's true of a large proportion too of the Labour Party membership. But if you look at the people who vote Labour in the general elections, you get a very different picture. Possibly up to 50% of traditional Labour supporters vote Leave. And this is really what is pulling the Labour Party in different directions. And the Labour Party is really not in a position to kind of denounce the whole idea of the last referendum because of it, the electoral base it's got, although I think large numbers of MPs and Labour Party supporters would like to see that happen. So it's very much pulled in different directions at the moment.
And I think what we've got at the moment is a Brexiteer leading a Remain party, pretending to be a Brexiteer in a Remainer in Jeremy Corbyn, and a Remainer in Theresa May leaving a Brexit party, pretending to be a Brexiteer. It's a very curious position to be in.
And nobody's very good at it.
And nobody's very good at it, yeah. And the idea that they're going to be, a wonderful debate in a few weeks, going to be an hour of evasive conversation,
Honestly.
I think. But the Labour Party itself had the top 10 Leave constituencies and also the top 10 Remain constituencies. So there is a genuine split, and we always maintain that actually if we didn't have a referendum and if the issue wasn't lanced at some point, our party would eventually suffer the most, because a majority of Conservative voters do support Leave, but ours is really split. And I think in terms of your question, who controls Labour policy, we know there is a battle going on at the moment within the shadow cabinet as to whether we should go down this second referendum route, whether Remain should be on the ballot and what the Labour Party should do on the deal. It really is quite split, and while the attention is obviously on the government because they're the ones conducting these negotiations, the real untold story at the moment in British politics is the battle going on in the Labour Party on this issue.
And the great challenge for those who want to do the right thing, because the referendum wasn't a normal representative democracy activity, it was this direct order, is those who want to do that, who are being hounded by some of the, I would say less salubrious aspects of, Labour backroom policy, and some of, Momentum's less pleasant members are, their lives are being literally made a misery when they simply want to do, what I think we would all say is the right thing is, the referendum result was given, so, speak,
get on with it.
Speak for your constituents. And I think that's very frightening, that level of intimidation and poison that's going on, and across the board, but particularly Labour MPs who want to do the right thing by their constituents are finding that their Labour parties are being hijacked, and that's very, very difficult. Which I find that I have friends across all parts of Parliament to watch this underhand, very powerful at a human level activity going on, which will drive decisions which are not the conscious decisions at a political level that people want to take because they are fearful of other things in their lives. That is a completely unacceptable way for British politics to behave. And the lack of respect. We chose to put a referendum to the people. I mean, I would suggest we don't try and do it again too often. It clearly is a very, very difficult thing to manage. But do you know what? We did that. We all chose to do that. We have to be the ones who say this is not like normal politics. We must deliver what it said. And that is just being broken at everyone. And I think for those who are not standing up for that absolutely critical weapon that can be used in democracies when really required, we should all be ashamed of ourselves, because what is the point of democracy if the UK doesn't stand up for what democracy means? How is the rest of the world supposed to understand it?
Now let's move on to the deal that is currently on the table. John, what do you see as fatally wrong with the deal that Theresa May has negotiated?
Well, I think the biggest single problem is that here's a country that within my lifetime was responsible for the sovereignty and to a degree for a quarter of the world, being retreated to a point where it is now going to be largely controlled in terms of its economic policy, its commercial policy, a lot of its social policy as well, by an organisation which doesn't necessarily have our best interests at heart. And this seems to be an extraordinary climb down, and it's a sort of climb down which means that the politics in this country are going to be quite heavily constrained. We all know that the rules that the single market entails, for example, conflict quite substantially with the sort of promises that Labour would like to put in its manifesto. And I mean, these are really very crucial to democratic issues, which I think are very disturbing.
Brendan?
No, I agree. I mean, in particular on state aid, as being a member of the single market does restrict the level of state activity within the economy. We just saw a few weeks ago the Italian budget that was put forward. The Commission basically turned around to the Italian government and said go back and do it again because of the sheer level of borrowing and investment by the state into industry in that country. Now, our manifesto, Labour's manifesto in 2017 had an enormous level of state activity measured in there. Things from the nationalisation of public utilities to all the phone systems, everything. Now that would require an enormous amount of borrowing and investment, and you would then have the state controlling large aspects of those industries. And in the single market, you can't do that because it's got to be out to tender to allow private competition. So really, for our people on our side, it's do you support the Labour manifesto or do you support staying in the European Union? You can't do both.
And that's quite a big discussion you've got to have, and,
Yeah.
and you've got a big effort to persuade people. I mean,
Well, it's not being had. I mean, we've got at the moment a very vocal group within the Labour Party who support continuing membership of the European Union, want us to stay in the single market and the customs union. They are, on the whole, what you might call more central Labour Party figures, not what you call traditional socialist Labour figures. That may have something to do with the support for the European Union. But that is a discussion that's got to be had, and I think Jeremy and John are subtly trying to put that forward. He had the Build It in Britain campaign over the summer, which placed huge emphasis on activity in this country, procurement in this country, supporting industry in this country, which of course you can't do explicitly if you're in the single market. But rather than just tinker around the edges on this, come out and say it. Everyone knows you're a Brexiteer, Jeremy. Don't sort of be a closet Brexiteer, just do it, and I think you get a lot more support and respect for it.
but do you think there's a part of Jeremy Corbyn that just wants the Tory government to get over the line and to make Brexit happen, so that he is not in a position ever where he's having to try and lead a government that takes the UK out of the European Union, which clearly his party would not go along with?
I imagine there is an element of that, but at the same time, he's got to be conscious of the fact that if this deal that the Prime Minister has negotiated, it becomes UK law, half of what he wants to do when he gets into government, he will not be able to do. So it's all very well sitting on your hands at the moment and saying, leave it to the Prime Minister, who is in some difficulty. He'll come back and bite you later on if you don't have a say now.
I must say, I think it's also a terribly dangerous strategy to say, let's sign with the withdrawal agreement to get ourselves over the line. Because what we're giving up in terms of what the difficulties are going to be in future in terms of negotiation are really huge.
But I think there's an outrageous false premise going on, which a number of people have put to me, which is, well, sign the withdrawal agreement now, change it later or bin it later. This is an international treaty under international law. The political declaration is all discussions to be had later. Fine, nice idea, all sounds rosy. All predicated on the back of whatever the withdrawal agreement is that we sign up to. It's a treaty. We signed the Treaty of London in 1911 and went to war and lost 722,000 young men on the back of standing up to a treaty that we'd signed. Come back to the same point, if the UK doesn't believe in these international rules and what it is that parliaments determine, people are happy to do that and either later on go, we didn't really mean it, or, oh my God, now we're trapped. It means it's unbelievable that any colleague, as far as I can see, can be comfortable going to bed at night thinking, well, I'll sign it, but somehow it's not real, or I don't understand the backstop, which actually it clearly is maintaining us in a customs union. I'm just going to ignore that bit because it's uncomfortable. Prime Minister continues to say it's uncomfortable for us and it's uncomfortable for the EU. Logic dictates, let's not have it. Let's find an alternative solution, which can be done, as everyone is suggesting. Let's remove the bit that is so utterly unacceptable and takes our sovereignty away, takes our freedom to make trade deals away, and let's start from there. But we cannot, in any conscience, put our names to the withdrawal agreement as it stands if we believe in UK sovereignty and if we believe in international treaties having a value.
I think that's quite right, that point about international treaties, because we will be looking to sign treaties with other countries, all being well, afterwards. And what would another country think if we offer to sign a treaty with them and we have just broken one that we've signed only a few months previously? Clearly our credibility would be deeply questioned, and that would undermine the entire pretense of having a independent trade policy. But I think really the issue that comes down, really the criticism crystallises around that one word of backstop. The implementation period, withdrawal period, transition period was always going to be very uncomfortable because the concept had been accepted a long time ago that we would be members of the European Union in all but name for these 2 years. So there's a lot in there that was always going to be very difficult. And you could, if you want to take a pragmatic view, simply say, well, we'll get through that. That's a 2-year period and then we get through to the other side. But the difficulty for that is the backstop, because it is, I'm not aware of another occasion when a country has put itself in a position of signing a commercial agreement where there isn't an exit clause.
And of course that backstop is the thing which, on Brexit Central this morning, we've published a leaked document from the House of Commons EU legislation team that says that the customs union would result from the backstop would put barriers in the way of doing trade deals with other countries. Now, the Prime Minister continues to maintain that as part of Brexit, we will have an independent trade policy and be able to sign deals with whomsoever we like.
So
isn't that just dishonest?
Well, it's the practical point, is that she's not lying. We will legally be able to, because we will legally have left the EU on at the end of March next year. But we won't in practice be able to, because what they would have to sign up to would be a trade deal which looks like the EU one now. So that would be, just the same as now, only we would have less control over the whole thing.
Of the scope of what
so
those trade
it's
deals
not
would cover.
untrue that we can, it's just that nobody will. So it's all good in name only. We're back to Bruno, we're back to all those, it is simply in name. So she isn't lying when she stands in the dispatch box and says that, but she is being disingenuous.
What about when she said no deal is better than a bad deal? Did she ever believe that?
Doesn't look like it at the moment. There we have the opportunity still to walk away next week and say that just won't do. We cannot put our names
if the
out.
House of Commons voted down next week.
Now let's move forwards, which is what I asked her in PMQs last week, is when is she going to spend the money which has been put in reserve, there's 3 to 4 billion in the Treasury accounts, actually spend it so that we are ready for WTO deal frameworks at the end of March. That's a practical spending. HMRC need to employ new people. We need to buy some new software. That's boring stuff. It's preparing. Business needs to know what software it needs to buy. This is spending real money to get prepared. And by doing it, we probably won't need that stuff, because the EU will then come back to the table and go, do you know what, this actually would be a disaster for us economically. And still, they might not, because the EU's proposition is a political one, not an economic one. And they are entitled to that position. I don't stand with the, evil EU. They've got a project on. They're welcome to carry on. I still think it'll fall over, and I don't think it's a very good one. But they're welcome to carry on. We mustn't forget that's what they're standing up for. That is a political proposition first and an economic one second. And it has so proven to be over the last year that those individual business voices coming from EU countries have not diverted the EU Commissioner's project at all.
The point about preparing for a world trade deal basis is a very important one, because that's what is responsible government anyway. It may be that that's what we end up embarking upon, and so the government needs to be prepared. So the sooner we do that and the more we do that, the better. But in any event, even if that's not what you're aiming for, it'll make your negotiating position much, much stronger, and you're more likely to get a deal if you've prepared for there not being a deal. So it's essential that is full speed ahead now.
I mean, John, you're a businessman of many years standing. Are you happy to go forward on WTO terms, so-called no-deal Brexit?
Well, I think they're much better than the offer that we've got on the table at the moment from the Prime Minister. I think in the end we probably won't finish up there, and I hope we don't. I think it'd be much better if we can maintain free trade with the European Union. But I think that you're absolutely right. Unless you're prepared to stand up for yourself, even if you get the sort of answers you don't want, you don't get the answers that you do want.
Brendan?
Well, and again, just on this, it's the language of all this too that I think is very important. When we're told we will leave with no deal, we're not leaving with no deal, we're leaving on World Trade Organization terms, which is what most countries in the world operate on. And so language is very important. This, and the Remain side are very good at crashing out with no deal, walking away with no deal. It all sounds very doom and gloom, but actually all it means is you become like any other country in the world.
I mean, the Australians have been very quite brutal about that last week. Tony Abbott was writing saying, well, what's wrong with it? It's how we trade. It seems to work for us. Why is suddenly the UK not going to be able to do this? Sort of almost, you suggesting the rest of us are somehow inferior because we're using what is the global methodology.
And there's no reason why you can't have sectoral real deal to deal with some of the more administration aspects, cross-border issues, as every other country does.
And many of those have been set up.
Much of that's been set up. There's some of that that's in the withdrawal agreement, which we could adopt and use anyway. So the concept of no deal is just is misleading anyway.
I mean, there's a supposition now that the government will lose the vote next week, which would be to conclude that the House of Commons think it is a bad deal. How do you think the Prime Minister will respond to that?
Well, there's a number of different options that could be taken. I mean, the first and the most obvious thing is to go back to the European Union and say the House of Commons will not accept this, and then to put forward some proposals, removal of the backstop or massive amendment of it is the first and most obvious step to take. But there are more radical solutions that could be taken as well in terms of different trading relationships, to lay out the Canada plus that many of us would favour in the first place, and lay that out as an end destination now, and then deal with a trade facilitation treaty to deal with the Irish border issues.
I mean, if the European Union said we'll remove the backstop, then do you think, Anne-Marie, that would become then acceptable to?
I think very large numbers of
like
colleagues,
yourselves?
very large numbers of colleagues who just can't bring themselves to vote for it next week, are saying if that was a real change and everyone stepped away from the political games that the backstop effectively is and said we can sort this out in a fair way, where we have unilateral rights to walk away. The key point of what that does is it sucks our sovereignty away. To get that right, I think very large numbers of colleagues would come back to the table at that point.
And of course, it's been reported in the papers over the last 24 hours that if the government does lose the vote, then it would table a vote of no confidence in the government from the government, from the opposition front bench. Is that the most helpful thing to do at this stage?
I think personally, it would be necessary, because if your plank policy fails and you can't get enough support even within your own parliamentary party for it, you clearly have lost the confidence of a majority of the Commons, and in that case, I think you do lose the right to automatically be in power. Whether a motion of confidence would pass, I don't know. That would depend on those that are putting the letters to the Prime Minister, whether they would vote to keep her in or vote with the opposition. But at this stage of the game, I think anything's possible. I don't think you can rule anything out at the moment. As we said, by the time this goes out, all sorts could have happened.
I think
my assumption is that
we're also conflating slightly two things. So let's assume Keir Starmer brings a vote of confidence, and strangely enough, we all roll in behind our own party and it fails. Let's assume one. Obviously, I hope that would happen. Then the question is, do we have confidence in our leader? So that's two separate things. So I think we would all vote to have confidence in our party and in the government remaining as it is. It's a separate question of whether, so it's not the Parliament's view on the Prime Minister. We then, as a party, will have to have that conversation as to whether we have confidence in her. And I think there will be probably those who have continued to, give her the benefit of the doubt and hoped that we would get to the right place, who may, I think, eventually run out of steam.
Yes, the attitude of the DUP is going to be very crucial on all this. Yes. I mean, the DUP have said that they're not prepared to support the government necessarily. Now, if they don't, and they vote the other way, then I think the government would be in trouble. So I think a lot's going to turn on what happens with the DUP and the extent to which they're prepared to support the government rather than to precipitate the general election.
But of course, under the Fixed Term Parliament Act, to a no confidence vote to generate a general election would require 2/3 of the House to vote against it, and I think even the turkeys on our side aren't going to vote for that Christmas. I might be wrong. Honestly, we live in a mad world, but I think even our Tory turkeys won't vote for that Christmas.
In terms of Theresa May's position, a lot will depend, will it not, on how she responds, literally, again, assuming the vote is defeated on Tuesday, how she responds that Tuesday night. My assumption would be that she would have to get up at the dispatch box after losing that vote to make some form of statement. And if she doesn't satisfy enough of her colleagues, of you guys, that she's going down the right course in reaction to that defeat, I've spoken to some of your colleagues who haven't put in no confidence letters yet, but who would hand them in that night.
I think that's quite likely. But I think I'm right in saying the government has 14 days to respond to a no confidence motion, so she doesn't necessarily.
No, I'm talking about the vote on the Brexit deal,
absolutely,
rather than a no confidence vote.
she will have to make some sort of statement. She's not prone to doing things in a hurry. She's a considered person. So I'd be surprised if at 11 o'clock at night, when we voted through however many amendments it is we'll have to get through, she would be minded to go to the nation at that point. That would go against her normal way of doing things. I would think there would be a considered statement the next day, which, indeed, will be Prime Minister's questions.
Then, of course, she's off to Brussels, the European Council, the following day after that.
Yes, but there would be Prime Minister's questions followed by a statement of some description.
I think it's likely that whatever happens, there'll be a period of reflection, and I think that is to be expected in times such as this, which are very complicated and a lot of possible ramifications of any particular course of action. What I really do hope does happen is that there's a reflection which leads to an outcome that the vast majority of the Conservative Party can support.
Absolutely.
Yes, I think one of the really important things about this whole episode around Brexit is to try and get something at the end of the day which the country can unite round. And it does seem to me that one of the real risks at the moment is that we finish up with a sort of extremes on one side or the other. One side wanting to stay into the European Union, the other side having a hard Brexit. Whereas really what I think that if we could find something like the Canada plus deal, which gave a lot to most people, that would be a much better outcome and something that was stable for the future. Otherwise, if we have a second referendum and the EU countries decide by a narrow majority to stay in, which is always a possibility, I think Euroscepticism will just continue for as far ahead as we can see, and the country will go on being divided, the parties will split. This is no way really to run the country.
I was going to say, I think the thing that would unite all of you around this table is that you don't want another referendum.
No.
Well, we've had two. We've had the referendum followed by a general election spelling out very clearly the same position. So I think we've had two. What are we? Is it like women's tennis? Is it best of three? Or was it men's tennis? Best of five? What we're going for?
Yeah.
I think it's very clear what people voted for. Please take us out of the EU. That means taking us out of the EU, becoming genuinely a separate sovereign nation to the EU bloc. It's quite straightforward. That's what people say to me in the street. I got lambasted by farmers on both sides on Friday night, but that's what they said. I thought taking us out of the EU meant taking us out of the EU. For my lamb farmers, that's quite a disruptive activity. But that's what they understood by the referendum result.
I just want to nail one particularly important point about the People's Vote campaign, whereby they talk about Remain as an option. I think we should be quite clear that the status quo is gone. Any request to remain in the European Union would be the subject of negotiation. It's inconceivable that after the last 2 years the EU would simply say come back in on existing terms. You would almost certainly be asked to surrender the rebate, possibly join the euro, surrender other opt-outs that we have as well. Schengen is a very good point, but even more importantly than that, any negotiating heft that we have had up till now has been predicated on the basis that Britain might leave. If we were to rejoin, you can never again make that point, and the European Union will continue in a direction of travel, of integration, of a much more dirigiste, much more statist, centralised, federalised construct that Britain is or has always been uncomfortable with. That's the direction of travel, and if we were to go back in, no one should be under any illusions about the fact that the status quo is not an option.
Now, the official Labour policy is to have everything on the table, including the idea of another referendum, although during the weekend TV shows there seemed to be confusion about what the options would be if it ever came to pass. That's part of the problem, isn't it?
I think there's a huge difference apart from anything else about what the questions are going to be and what is actually going to be in the referendum. I think the idea of having a choice between what the Prime Minister's offering now and rejoining the referendum, if that's just rejoining the European Union, if it's after the 29th of March, is really completely unacceptable from a democratic point of view. I think it's really essential to have different options, including the free trade deal, which I think all of us around this table would support, on the agenda. But then you get a very, very complicated way of running this referendum. I think there are huge practical and timing difficulties and legal difficulties and delay difficulties about a referendum, which in the end are going to make it impractical.
But we will have left anyway by the time that comes through on guess what, a WTO deal basis, prepared or unprepared, even if that was to run, because that's the nature of the time frame required for the Electoral Commission.
Although
and all the processes.
Well, practically it takes the best part of a year to organise and run a referendum campaign.
But there are those who are saying, let's just suspend Article 50 while we hang around and organise the referendum.
But if you're looking, I mean, one of the things that is a criticism of this process, and one of the things that business always talks about, is they want certainty. I mean, that is the exact opposite of providing certainty. If you suspend Article 50 with an indeterminate outcome, you have another referendum which could lead to any number of results.
And I think I mind saying, if we suspend Article 50, the UK in May would have to take part in European Parliament elections, which would be absurd.
Oh,
would
good
it
Lord,
not?
we'd have to do that all over again. They've reallocated all our money and seats. I mean, that would be very complicated for everybody. And I think we might find that the seemingly almost defunct UKIP party rises from the ashes rather faster than anyone would like.
Well, that's the risk, actually. We spoke a lot today, but there are millions of Labour voters and millions of Conservative voters who voted to leave, and voters from other parties and people that have never voted before. They felt for the first time in years that they were actually going to make a difference in their vote. And my fear is, if we get this deal, or if we have another referendum, or whatever attempts are made to try and overturn the referendum result, in March next year, you are going to have a very large portion of the population of this country completely disenfranchised and frankly furious with both sides. And what could come from that? You mentioned earlier on the possible splintering of politics. I think you could see a real fundamental realignment between those people who voted leave and no longer trust anyone. And that could be a plague on all our houses. If we don't want that, and if we want Britain to continue to be a sensibly run country, this referendum has got to be implemented. Not the deal she's got, but the referendum we all fought for, and the conclusion we thought we were going to get.
You should never underestimate the divisiveness that the People's Vote campaign will cause.
They are very
It would be
divisive.
incredibly, I mean, there's no getting away from it. Whatever position you take on the original referendum, i.e. the 2016 referendum, it was divisive. Well, a request to think again would be even more so. I mean, the suggestion this would bring the country back together is fanciful.
So perhaps I finish by asking you all in a few sentences to say where you think things are going to be by
Tea time?
I was going to say by next March. You can choose your time frame, but just give me a feeling of where you think things are going over the next few days and weeks. John?
Well, I think there's going to be a period of reflection, as you said. And what I would hope would happen is that we could get back to first base on all this and negotiate a free trade deal. I mean, this was offered by Donald Tusk in March this year. It was offered most recently by Michel Barnier. I mean, I do think there is a real prospect of getting some agreement on that basis, which would satisfy the Leave campaign people. It would be, I think, acceptable for most of the more reasonable Remain people, and that would be a much better outcome. Now, I think we need to go through a process of turning down the existing deal before we can get there. But I think if we stand firm and go back to the European Union, that's much the best way ahead, and that's what I really hope is going to happen.
I mean, certainly, in terms of the law, we are leaving. The European Union will be outside the Treaty of Rome, March 29th at 11 o'clock next year. That's what I think will happen, constitutionally and legally. In practice, I don't know. I wouldn't like to say. I've just got a nasty feeling that we are going to end up with some sort of fudge that means Euroscepticism in this country, and what we spoke about a few moments ago, could become the reality, and we see a big shift in British politics.
Robert?
Well, I think absolutely, as I say, we do need to have a period of reflection, and where I would like us to end up and where I think we should be ending up is coming up with a compromise position, a deal, yes, but one that is supported by the vast majority of the Conservative Party and the country as a whole can get around, and I think that really is still within reach.
I think the rule agreement will be voted down next week, which gives everybody the opportunity to credibly say to the EU, this is not the way we can go forward. You understand now, when we said we're getting our sovereignty back, that's what we needed you to negotiate with us on the trade side and on all the other relationships that we have. And we will, as Brendan says, we will leave at the end of March in legal terms. What we must have, and it can be in stages, nobody denies that 40 years of entanglement can necessarily be sensibly unravelled all at once, is to always be able to have choice to step away from something in future. So what is listed in the political declaration at the moment, which is the fluffy, perfect world later on part of this whole process, many of those things are not to even a status quo, not even an advantage for the UK, but they're not good for us, or indeed the EU, on security, on all sorts of issues. We have to have a process which the man and woman in the street can honestly believe makes sense as we become an independent nation. They're not stupid, our voters, and I sometimes wonder if those who live in the Westminster bubble get out enough, because up in the northeast, 350 miles away from Westminster, people are very straightforward and they can tell a lie or a half-truth at 100 paces. And if it makes sense, however slowly we get there, they will support it. If it doesn't make sense, they will know. If they're being screwed by their government or by the EU, they will know, and we will all suffer from it, and democracy will forever be damaged.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. And on that note, I will thank our panellists, John Mills, Brendan Chilton, Robert Courts and Anne-Marie Trevelyan. It's been brilliant to have your thoughts on all that's going on, and I dare say we might reconvene sometime before too long for another BrexitCentral Labour Leave production, because there's a lot to talk about.